Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining in and listening to this study today. It's a beautiful day out there. Hope you are being blessed by it and enjoy this great weather that God has given us today. As you can see on your screen, hopefully, you see we are continuing our study in the book of Judges, and we're in chapter 3, picking up at verse 7, where we have a shift here of what happened. Again, Judges is going to be some very up and down um, worship, and loyalty is probably the better word to put it. And so, verse 7, it says, The children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord, forgot the Lord their God, and served Baalim and the groves. Now, this is King James English here, and what's interesting here is we don't get a real sense of what they were doing when they forgot God. Obviously, we can understand that pretty well, but what did they uh, move into? What kind of realm of uh, servitude and religious system, I guess is the word. Where did they go to? What kind of paganism and idolatry? So we're just going to take a quick look at the Hebrew here and look at a couple interesting words. Here you see we're starting with verse 7. Hebrew reads from right to left, and you can read underneath that they forgot Yahweh. This is important to notice this throughout this passage. You will see the word Yahweh being used, which gives the understanding this is the merciful, compassionate side of God, still being displayed, still being offered, if you will, by the Lord in the midst of their unfaithfulness. And I think that's key to understanding that, which is something you don't pick up in the English. We don't know what frame of mind God is in when things happen, especially when it's talking about his anger and his wrath being poured out, but yet to see that tempered by using the word Yahweh, where otherwise it would just have Elohim, which you see in the next word of um, Elohechem is their God. The hem in the end just means their God. It's the plural. But it shows that God is still operating in a merciful realm. He's still wanting to extend his mercy, even though the children of Israel have forsaken him. And basically, um, think of this relationship with God as a marriage agreement, that God is the husband. We are the Israelites here are the wife, and the wife is going and committing adultery. And that's how God views it. That's why the family unit is set up the way it is. And that's why God is so adamant about singularity of heart, keeping sanctity in the marriage, keeping the husband and wife relationship and the family unit together, because it's patterned after his relationship with us. And so here it's very strongly brought out. And we see that throughout the scriptures that when people turn away from God, in his mind, it's the same as if a wife or a husband is cheating on their spouse and committing adultery. And so we see that here by the fact that it's using the word Baals, which is a male um, gendered deity of and Baal is used also in places of being a master or a lord. So this is someone that's dominating them, a male type imagery that's dominating them in a very harsh way. We see that in the pagan gods, there's always sexual immorality associated with their worship. And so the male figurines used here uh, denote the masculine side of the immorality that's coming upon us. But when we go to the King James Version, it says Baalim and the groves. And so the word the groves, we kind of miss the interpretation. Like, well, what's so big about it? Were they worshiping trees? Were they worshiping nature? In reality, the word here is Ashtaroths. And this is a feminine deity. And we'll just click on this hyperlink here that just takes us and shows us that this word Ashtaroth comes from a Phoenician goddess, image of this Phoenician goddess. And so what we're seeing here is the masculine and feminine sides of sexual immorality. And what the groves mean here is this is where the women that were the priestess of Ashtoreth, where they danced around. In modern vernacular, think of stripper poles, if you will, and that these women were dancing around these poles to entice the men with their dances. That's why it's called a grove. There were many poles there, many trees there that these women would dance around. So now that you got this very vivid picture of what was going on, both from a masculine side and a feminine side of sexual immorality, it's no wonder that God's heart was broken. They had prostituted themselves against God, and so the Lord was not happy. Again, we've seen the word for hot, the anger of the Lord, meaning that his emotions were just risen within him because he had been cheated upon. And so he sold them into the hand of this guy, Hush. In the Hebrew, it's not quite so big of a word. Um, it's Hushan Rishatayim. And he was the king, here it says of Mesopotamia, but it's really of Amram. And so we're going to take a look at where that is on the map. Um, and you see up here in the upper right corner, this kind of darker uh, reddish color. You see the Aram. So these guys came from the north and came down and invaded this area of Israel. We don't know if they took everything. Did they go all the way down to the bottom? Did they just take this upper half? We'll see a little bit more when we see where the judge was raised up for. So we see that they were under this oppression for 8 years. Now, what's interesting here is when we get to verse 9, it says that the children of the Lord cried out unto the Lord, and the Lord raised up a deliverer. What we lose here is the perspective of were they crying out for 8 years, from day one when they were sold into the power of this king from Amram. Did they start crying out for 8 years and it took 8 years for the Lord to answer their prayer? Or did it take 8 years before they cried out to the Lord because actually, they were having you know, their lifestyle was continuing the way they were. They didn't notice anything different to begin with, but it wasn't until 8 years later that things started to really, the wheels came off the wagons, if you will, and they got desperate and they started to cry out to the Lord. I guess the short answer is it doesn't matter how long. We just know that God heard their cry and he answered them. And to me, that's the important thing of knowing that God heard their cry. And again, the Lord raised up a deliverer. What you lose here in the English is what is the word Lord? What is the word deliver? Deliverer, we see that it's Othniel, the son of Kenaz, who is Caleb's brother. Okay, well, we get a family history here, knowing we know who Caleb was. Joshua and Caleb were the two men that when the 12 spies were sent out, they came back with a good report. They survived the next 40 years. Everyone else died off, and they actually went into the promised land. So they were the celebrities. And here was a relative, basically the nephew, Othniel, of Caleb. So he's well known. Let's just take a look at the Hebrew here a little bit. And so it says they cried out to Yahweh, which is again translated as Lord, but you don't get the impression of if it's God or Lord or what word is being used in Hebrew. But in Hebrew here, we see the compassionate side name of God, Yahweh. And look how many times it's mentioned that they cried out to Yahweh. Yahweh raised up a deliverer. What's interesting here is this word for deliverer is mo uh, Moshoia, and it comes from the word Yasha is the root word, and some of you might be able to hear the word Yeshua in there, and it would be rightfully so. These words are related, that this is a deliverer, this is a redeemer, and so that's what's beautiful to me is here in studying the Hebrew, you get to see glimpses of the of Yeshua, the our Redeemer. Yeshua is Hebrew translated into somewhat of a mistranslation in English and Latin mixed, and is where we get the word name Jesus from. So that's what's exciting to me as I'm reading through here, is to see this word for deliverer and attached to God's name. So here we see the guy he chose is Othniel. And of course, when we take a look at his name, we see he's a hero. We don't really get any information on what his name means, but remember, every name has a meaning. And so Othniel just means to burn. So this guy had a zeal, had a passion about him. And this is just all fascinating things occurring here in verse 9 and the more and 10. And the more that I looked at it, the more questions I had is, okay, who was this guy? He obviously had a pedigree. He was the nephew of a very renowned um, celebrity in Israel of Caleb. But what was his life like? Why did God choose him? The fact that it says he raised him up as a deliverer means that, okay, we have these questions. Why him? Was he chosen for his goodness? Was he chosen for his physical strength? Was he chosen for his humbleness? Was he chosen because he comes from a family that were successful leaders and military leaders? Did Kenaz teach him the ways of warfare because he was involved in this lineage of military history? We really don't know why God chose him. It doesn't give us any indication, but we do know that he was not capable on his own, because verse 10 says that the Spirit of the Lord came upon him. We're going to just look at that verse here because that's pretty fascinating. Um, what we see here is Ruach Yahweh, Spirit of Yahweh. So this isn't a fighting, fighting spirit of conquering the enemy with power and with a sword and thunder and lightning bolts. It is the spirit of the compassionate, loving, merciful God. And so I find that very, very unique and very encouraging. Even though we know that, battles took place and wars took place, this wasn't God looking for vengeance. This was God looking for restoration, of bringing his people back into that relationship with him that they had violated. And so his purpose was not to annihilate Israel. His purpose was to restore Israel. And so we see that spirit um, upon this young man, Othniel. So the next questions, many of them that go through my mind, is what happened when this spirit came upon him? We see in other places that the Spirit of Yahweh would come upon prophets and they would speak in ecstasy. We have had studies that show that that's very similar to the Spirit that came upon the apostles in the early church on the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2, when they were filled with the Holy Spirit and they spoke in other tongues, speaking in ecstasy. Is that what happened to Othniel here? Or was it something like when Samson received his strength and the Spirit of God came upon him, another judge that we're going to get to down the way here? What we assume he was emboldened by this um, episode, by this experience that he had, that something came upon him and changed him and took him into a realm that he was not normally accustomed to being in, and that God was with him. Now, look at verse 10, what it says, that he judged Israel, went out to war, and looking at that word, this is all in a singular form here. It says that Yahweh delivered them into his hand. This is a third masculine singular word. Um, so it's like, okay, did he go into battle all by himself? And God worked such a mighty miracle through him that he's out there with his sword, or maybe nothing, and standing there proclaiming something in the spirit realm, and God fought his battle and delivered them into his hand. And it says his hand prevailed against them. It doesn't mention anything about the rest of the Israelites going out with him. It doesn't mention about the battle was great and Israel fought hard and, here's how many people died on Israel's side. Maybe nobody went with him. Maybe God did it all by his lonesome here through this young man. If so, this would have been a very, very incredible miracle that took place, which then gave some sustenance to why he was able to be in charge, and that these Israelites who did evil things and worshiped other gods, he was able to keep them under control for 40 years. He was able to rule over them and not just rule, but to keep them united in their worship, to keep them united in doing good things and not doing evil things. Now, remember that the tabernacle in the wilderness is standing. It's in Shiloh. The Levites are going through their sacrifices. The priests are there teaching the Torah, the uh, commandments. They're offering the sacrifices. They're teaching the people. Nothing has changed there. So why did he have the ability to keep them serving God, having no idols in the land? And he did this for 40 years. What was it about him? I would love to know more. Would love to know more. What was life like under his realm? Did he rule? I can't imagine he ruled with an iron fist dictatorship that if anybody stepped on a line, he snuffed them out and punished them because the spirit of Yahweh was upon him. Not a harsh spirit, but a spirit of love and mercy, of compassion, that somehow he must have been able to transmit this and that people served him because they were loyal to him and loved him and saw God in him, and that his life manifested such a strong presence of God that it naturally drew the people to want to serve the same God that he was serving. And there was obviously something there because when it got to verse 11, he died. Okay. And they did not live happily ever after. Let's just look at where Othniel was. Remember, we said that the um, Amorites came in from the north. Well, here's Othniel lives in the city of Debir, which again is very interesting because the word Debir is a name that means words spoken from the heart in Hebrew. And so I find that quite interesting that Othniel spoke words from the heart, godly words, God words that were supported by the mercies and the compassionate side of God. But as soon as he was gone, we get to verse 12, and what happens? Poof, they fall away. They did evil in the sight of the Lord. And I just find this incredulous, incredible, hard to comprehend. Why did he not train a successor? Was his successor a failure? Or did it have to do with the fact that God's Spirit rested upon him and it didn't rest upon anybody else in such a way? I guess that's where my thoughts are going, that it's a teaching tool here to show that it has to come from the heart, that serving God has to come from God's presence inside of us, motivating us, and that without God's presence filling a person, they will not overcome. They will not be able to stand against the temptations. They will not have the love relationship that's needed to survive in the midst of a evil, temptatious world. And that's just my musings on this. You may come up with some different thoughts, but there was definitely something about Othniel that with God's presence inside of him, he was able to influence a whole nation for 40 years. And with that challenge and with that thought, I'm going to leave you today. And we'll pick up on that next week as we come back on verse 13. So God bless you. Pray God will strengthen you and just give you greater insight and wisdom as you study his word. Take care. Bye bye.